Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And before we get started, last week we did an episode on like the care and feeding of people. And I have a sort of second thought to add.
Second thoughts.
So here's my second thought. We talked about this like care and feeding thing. And then I've had this really great experience of it, which is that I've been working with a social media person, actually for a client, but and that's like a timely thing. And when I met her and when we worked together, I said, look, don't ever let me be the bottleneck of things. I know that we're just starting this relationship. There are things you're going to need to run by me. And I want you to, and I always want to be available for questions, but there are days where I'm facilitating all day long or, whatever. So don't let me be the bottleneck. And so if you don't hear from me, like check back or whatever. Well, she took that and did something really fantastic that I have so appreciated. And I'm going to start working this in, I think, as client advice, was she will send me something, say, here's what I'm thinking I'm going to do. And then right near the top, so I see it, even if I don't read all the way to the bottom of the email, says, if I don't hear from you by, and then she puts like end of business today or by tomorrow, because there are different time for like, sometimes it's just a big idea and she doesn't really need to know right away. But if I don't hear from you, I'm going to go ahead and do this thing. And what's fantastic is like most of the time I'm like, that means I don't even have to respond.
Right.
So it saves me a step. And I told her that I was like, if you don't hear from me, it's because it's all good. One time though, it helps me prioritize whether I need to respond and whether I need to respond today. So there was one time where she was like, I'm going to do this if I don't hear from you. And I was like, oh, wait, we can't do that because blah, blah, blah. And I knew I needed to get right back to her because there were constraints around it. And it's been such a like exhale weight off my shoulders because of that little thing we put into place, which just makes it all work because I was sharing that like care and feeding aspect. So.
See, it's funny because in my world, I use that as a weapon. And I mean that seriously, actually, because
sure.
for my clients in contracts, particularly in construction, they're always waiting on instructions from the general or somebody higher. Yeah. And they're also going to be held accountable for scheduling delays. Yeah. So somebody else's bottleneck is their problem. And so I'll tell them to put in messages, this is what we're going to do. If we do not hear from you by such and such a time, we will assume that you consented to this and we will proceed. Right. Now I hear you. But it's incredibly useful. But that's the whole point, is that in some situations, I think that's the whole point to that topic, is that what is a tool for one person in one situation or for one person is a weapon in others. And you can't know, so bringing that invisible to the visible. If she just started doing that without us talking about it, I don't know how. Then it would be a little bit. It would feel a little bit passive aggressive. A little thready or something. I don't know. And that's the whole point. It may or may not be rational. It's just is. But because we talked about it, I'm like, oh, this is an excellent way to do this. So anyway, but that is true. It is interesting because if she didn't mention it and you got something that says, if I don't hear from you, I'm just going to go ahead and do it, then you might ascribe a real tone to that. Like, oh, she just thinks that I can't, whatever it is. And I think that's really interesting. Since I don't have the comparison, but that's the whole point of just simply dragging these things out into visible light. So you can be like, okay, here's how we're going to handle this. So there you go. That's my thought. Okay. So why don't you thank our sponsor? Yes, I'm going to drag our sponsors out into visible light. I'd like to thank Tom Loveland at Mind Over Machines, Cat's Copy, the architecture firm of GWWO, and Marycraft Staffing and HR Solutions. So here's my story. I was talking to a client the other day, and what struck me was not the fact that he was telling me how he got a $5 million contract. What struck me was how the incumbent, the one that really had the inside track on this contract, lost a $5 million job. And it was a tiny little thing. So this was a huge tenant build out job, and the customer who granted my client the job was actually watching another construction company do work at the building next door. And they were doing a really pretty good job. And he figured, he saw their trucks every single day and he was going to call them because he figured, look, they know the area, obviously. They know the building, obviously. They've been around. They have guys that are in the area. They have forces to do it. And then he said, the customer said, I was looking out my window one day and I saw one of their guys and I kind of took a hard look at him and he looked his hair was like stringy and he was kind of disheveled. But the thing that got me was he was smoking a cigarette in the parking lot. And when he either finished his break or finished the cigarette, he flicked it. And he just flicked it into the parking lot. And the guy said to my client, and I thought, if that's the attention to detail and quality that their people exhibit, I don't want them working on my project. Now, you can say that's a rush to judgment. You can say that's inadequate sampling.
Or you can say it's super intuitive.
Yeah. But that cigarette flick cost that company unknowingly $5 million.
I'm imagining every construction company owner in the area who listens to this podcast now being like, was that my guy?
Yeah. And I'll give you another example. Hey, look, it's 2 stories for the price of 1.
Dun, dun, dun.
This was non-construction. I went to a restaurant with a client of mine. We met for lunch and I had never been to this place. And it's this little, nice place, but little family owned. It wasn't a chain thing. And as we were talking, we were at a table for 4. They would bring over iced tea or something. There's a straw and you take the wrapping off your straw and kind of crumple it and it's on the table. And the wrapping for the napkin, that little adhesive ring, and you take it off and you crumple it's on the table. So during the meal, certainly at the beginning, there's this little pieces of tiny trash that nobody ever notices. But what I did notice is that when various people came over, from the person who would fill the water glasses to the person I presume was the owner to certainly the waitress, they would, while talking to us without even making a big deal out of it, they would gather that stuff and they would take it off. And it wasn't a bad thing if it stayed on the table because it always stays on the table. But I did walk away thinking, if they have that attention to detail just on the table, then I bet their kitchen is pretty orderly and clean. And whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong, the impression I was left with is that these people care about details. And in a restaurant, that mattered to me.
Yeah, no, it's funny. It's almost like this is the, it's sort of the larger scale version of the care and feeding a little bit. Like the small things can often really matter. And I think where it can be so tough to implement in business environments, whether for your clients or customers or for the people that work for you, is that there's so much to deal with that trying to think about all the little things can feel, I can hear these sort of things. I'm like, oh gosh, I'm supposed to care about that too. Like there's like a, infinite overwhelm. But I think what I hear from what you're saying is actually, it simplifies in my brain a little bit when I think of it in terms of there are key things that you care about. Like in that one, if cleanliness or whatever you want to call it, there's sort of a theme, and it doesn't mean that you have to handle every tiny little thing. It's sort of navigating by an overarching value or theme that is important, that kind of creates almost like a good kind of vacuum that pulls all the details together into one thing. So it doesn't feel like you're trying to say to people, care about everything all the time. Every small thing matters. It's that some small things matter and some don't.
Well, and that's true. And also, you don't have to do it all at once. I mean, one of the things that you had said, and I believe it was in last week's episode, is that one of your clients made up a list of the care and feeding of Jody.
Mm-hmm. It was my assistant.
Your assistant.
Yeah.
Okay. And you can do that. You can, if your people, it's not that your people have to know of all the small things, but if you develop a consciousness that they'll just jot it down. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes part of the culture that over, each weekly meeting or whatever, you jot something down, you begin to compile these things. Mm-hmm. And so some examples of a couple small things. I was in a conversation with a client yesterday, and they were talking to me about this claim they got out of the blue from one of their customers. A lawyer had written looking for some amount of money. And my client thought it was a shakedown. But one of the things they said was, and their lawyer, we tried to call back and it just had some remote Google Voice thing try and track them down. And the demand was on, it looked like it was just on a blank piece of paper from Microsoft Word that he put his name up at the top. It wasn't really letterhead. And now he could be the greatest lawyer ever. But those things made my client more inclined to dismiss what he was saying.
Well, I think it's the same thing as and this isn't necessarily wrong, but I think you risk the same things. Like when you don't have like the domain as your email address.
Yes,
if it's like
Gmail
Elliot Wagenheimlaw@gmail.com, you're like, okay. Okay, well, we'll give it a shot, but first red flag, check.
Right.
I think those kinds of small things, for me, one of the things that made that list, because, this kind of is pervasive in all the things about how I run my client. I'm always, my clients are incredibly busy business owners. Their companies are growing. They have a lot on their plates, and I'm there to help them in that. So I see that through not just the time we spend together, but every bit of our interaction. And so one of the things that I care about, and it seems kind of nitpicky, but I care, is if I send a calendar invite, I send it entitled the way it makes the most sense on their calendar. Like if I was sending it to you, I wouldn't say Elliot Wagenheim. Like I get calendar invites sometimes that say Jody Hume. And I'm like, well, that's not terrible. Like if you want me to be someplace, I'm going to need more information.
And then you have to edit it and save it without sending that update to the other side.
Exactly. Because it's very complicated. Fortunately, if they're sending it, then they are in the invite list. So I can go into the thing and see like who it is. But so I'll send it like Elliot Wagenheim and Jody Hume. And that way, or I'm sorry, I will send it Jody Hume if I'm sending it, and Elliot Wagenheim, so that I see the both in there. And other little things, like if they're supposed to call me, I make sure my phone number is in there so they don't have to go look it up. My assistant knows that if I'm supposed to call them or something, that I need that phone number in there so I don't have to go look it up. It's just I value making things easy.
And speaking of calls, I do have to say this. If you've never called your office to just listen to how either the phone is answered or go into your voicemail.
Yes.
Because the voicemail hell is still a very real thing. And one of my pet peeves is also the outgoing message, when people will mix up their words, but they'll say, your call is very important to me. I will call you back at my convenience. And it just, I'm like, really?
I'll call you back when and if it matters.
Or, it's July 21st and you get that outgoing message that says, I'm going to be out of the office from March 5th to March 10th. Like, dude, just.
Well, it is the small things. And we all make those errors. But I was so happy when finally, we're really going off on tangents here, when at least Google finally added, because it just seems like an easy thing to add that, like, if you use the word attached in the email and then there's no attachment. I mean, like, that's a very simple algorithm, I would think. Like, if there's the word attached, ask me if there's something supposed to be attached. If I didn't attach it, because we've all done that and you just look like an idiot. You're like, yep, not attached. So there are those small things. But I think if I going back to like the calendar thing, I'm actually not a really formal, detailed person. I don't care often how things are done. I'm not really particular about how my dishwasher's loaded or anything like that. So it might seem out of step that I care so much about things like how the calendar invite is structured and whatnot. But I care about that because for me, it goes under this category of make it easy. I don't want anything about working with me to be challenging or frustrating or difficult. I tried to talk about voicemail. I tried to call I had to cancel an appointment with my doctor for next Monday. And I called and it had to go through this crazy voicemail thing. And then I finally got to where I needed to go. And it said, this voicemail is not taking messages. It didn't say it was full. It just said, this voicemail is not accepting messages. So I hit 0, went back to the main person. And she said, oh, okay, hold on. And she put me through to like somebody else. Listen to their voicemail. Also not taking messages. So then I had to go back again to the main person. And I was like, all the voicemails you're sending me to aren't taking messages. And she was like, oh, hold on 1 second. And as she puts me on hold, on comes this like advertisement background thing about like, we go the extra mile to care for, and I was like, I object. I think you really should stop playing that thing, because I'm just trying to cancel an appointment. And I almost had to hang up and call back, because I thought it was going to be like a 30-second thing, and it was like a 12-minute process, and I had to leave, but I did manage to get the appointment canceled. She was like, would you like to reschedule? I was like, no, not right now.
Yeah. So I started thinking about the little things that I do or that I need to pay attention to. So for example, in my world, I'm a lawyer. My stock in trade is supposed to be communication. So one of the things that I have to emphasize
you're making me step over every lawyer joke, but I thought your stock in trade was blah, 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 blah. Okay, sorry.
But so I'm supposed to, so I emphasize that when we send out even an email, even if we're texting, it has to be a professional communication, because if I send an email with sentence fragments or that's badly written, it doesn't have to be a novel, but it has to be well written, well expressed. Whereas that may not be how normal people communicate, but I'm being paid to communicate. Mm-hmm. So that's one of my hot buttons. I can't, there should be a capital letter after a period, to begin a sentence, just little things. And, we talk a lot about what we tell our kids because they're growing up in a different era. But I do tell my kids, if you're going to be judged on communication, I certainly am. Yeah. So that's a little thing that I have to pay attention to.
Right. Whereas in other industries, it's not as important.
Yeah, when in my clients' industries, it doesn't tend to be important, and I don't care. I certainly don't judge them. Oh, geez, they should have used a semicolon, but I don't judge them because that's not important to them, and it's not how I would assess their ability at what they do. But it is how somebody assesses my ability at what I do.
I almost want to title this episode "Semicolon Shame." So let's break this down though, because I go back to one of the first reactions I had is that sometimes when, people tell me things like that, the small things matter, there's a certain sense of overwhelm just because it already feels like there's so much to think about. And it's tricky because especially when it comes to customers, they sort of going back to the care and feeding thing from last episode, they care about different things sometimes. Yeah. And so the small things to them are sometimes things that you're like, oh, I didn't even know anyone cared about that. Like, gosh, okay, I guess we have to worry about that too. So how do we break that down? Like, how do you decide what small things matter? Like, what's the guidance for that?
I think one of the things that I would do, because I'm fascinated by the subject, one of the things that I would do, knowing that people are reluctant to criticize you, you're sitting across the table and you say, what bugs you about how I do business, or what bugs you about me? But you can say, what really irritates you about working with other banks, or what have you had a problem with in other restaurants, or even if it's not an affiliated industry, you just say, what did you notice? I really hated the shopping experience. What did you notice? And if you find stories from anybody about anything that really got them irritated, you would start to see a window into what they care about, whether it is sloppy writing or whether it is that. So for example, if I'm talking to somebody and they tell me that they were really irritated because they picked up their car from being repaired and it still had that little paper numbered sticker that's attached to or placard that's attached to the rearview mirror, and it still had plastic covering the floor. Now, those things are great because certainly the plastic is, because it keeps the debris from getting on the floor mats when people are in and out of your car. But because they're still there and you have to dispose of it, it's an inconvenience, and it shows that the other side the car dealer didn't have an attention to detail. If they tell me that story, I can take that to heart because I can think, well, they're really looking at what I do that either makes it easy for them or doesn't make it easy for them.
Yeah. But let's go back to the original two stories, because no one, I don't think, would ever say, like, it really matters to me when people, because you were saying, like, no one notices those little wrappers on the table. So
yes.
it's almost like an unnoticed thing that made the difference. And I don't think anyone would ever say, Like, I don't think any construction company would necessarily think to say, if you're smoking outside, don't flip your, I mean, it feels kind of like parenting where it's like, I never thought to tell you don't stick beans in your nose, like, cause I thought didn't even know that was a thing to think about.
But if the restaurant identifies that they want to show that they are meticulous, they are clean, they are a welcoming place, whatever, and they brainstorm, how can we kind of communicate that?
Well, no, see, that's what I wanted to get back to. I don't think it's about, it kind of reminds me of, those like iceberg graphics where there's like this little thing that sort of shows and all the stuff underneath of it. But in two ways. One, if you're hearing this and you're thinking about like all the small things there are out there, that bottom of the iceberg like would take over the whole planet. So I think it comes back to deciding maybe just the one thing, because that one thing will have an entire iceberg of things underneath of it. If what you want to as a restaurant come through is that you are meticulous about cleanliness, that means things like keeping the table tidy, like making sure the bathrooms are clean, like making sure the windows don't have like gunk on them. That iceberg shows up everywhere of like everything but you can't have 12 of those icebergs for people to pay attention to, or it's overwhelming. That's where I think it gets really overwhelming for companies, because it's tempting to have like, well, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this and this and this. Well, each one of those things has an entire iceberg of activities. And so it gets diffused. Whereas if you decide like, we had a roofing company come and do our roof. And not only were they incredibly clean oriented, like they put down mats over places, they just did they had to do some inside work, and they put down mats, they took off their shoes outside or put these like booties over. I mean, it was like a clean room or something. They were working. When they were done with our roof, because they replaced the whole roof, not only did they make sure all the shingles were gone, but I think they actually shop vacked our yard. I'm not kidding. I'm actually not kidding, because it was a level of clean where even like the grass was cleaner in between it. Like, I think they shop vacked our entire surrounding of our house, because it was a level of clean that was beyond even a normal kind of clean and tidy. And I've been tempted to call them and be like, did you shop vac our yard? But I think their thing was they didn't want to leave. I bet you, I could imagine this, or I could make it up. We don't want to leave a single nail.
Leave no trace.
It's leave no trace. And it's one thing to go around and make sure you picked up all the shingles and stuff, but you could easily miss a nail or two in the grass, and then a kid steps on it. And that's so yeah, I think they shop vac our yard.
Yeah, it is. And you're right about the iceberg and picking the one value or the two values like the roofing company did.
Pervasive.
And I remember, it was the late 90s when I was chief operating officer of the software company, and we brought in a new guy to be the executive vice president of marketing. And we had this meeting, and I didn't know much about marketing then, but I remember we had this meeting and he gave a presentation. And he was talking about all the different values that are important, innovation and cutting edge and whatever. And he said with great fanfare, and I'll tell you, this went over like a lead balloon, but I think he was right in retrospect. With great fanfare, he said, so what I really believe that we should make the cornerstone of our image is reliability. And he said it with such pride and whatever, and people were just staring at him like, whatever. Because it's not really an exciting thing, reliability.
It's not exciting, but it is.
But yeah, he was talking about software that we did point of sale software, big box stores, Bed Bath and Beyond, some others, Long's Drugs, Filene's Basement back in the day. And, if those systems shut down, your business goes dark. Yeah. So he chose reliability, and then he was selling it. And what he wanted to do was make sure that was infused into the DNA of every single department in the company. Right. So that then, just like with leave no trace or whatever, you think, all right, well, how can we emphasize reliability on what we do? And that means you're not late, you give a deadline, you meet that deadline, or you beat that deadline. You make sure that you can rely on this. If something goes wrong at 2 a.m., we'll have somebody there at 2:05.
I can literally put on those glasses of reliability and look around at every single aspect of the business, because you just named 2 very different aspects of where that show up.
Yeah.
I can name a third one. If we're prioritizing development, this kind of thing, we're going to prioritize reliability over innovation.
Right.
Like we'll do some innovation, but we're not going to be winging out there to try and like beat to market on the newest, coolest
We're not on the bleeding edge.
We're not on the bleeding edge, because our thing is reliability. And I think that having that, we've played around. There was an exercise I learned when I took the coaches training back in like 2003. That was really fascinating to me, because I get really irritated by, we've talked about doing the voices. We've hit this before, like, excellence and integrity. Those aren't values that translate into anything
Quality.
actionable, or it's not a litmus test you can use to decide what do I do, what matters, what's important. And so this was a values exercise to do with an individual, but you would have them tell you stories, actually. Mm-hmm. And then from that, you would start to write down these words that sounded like you're hearing these words that are in there. And then they would look at them, they would add them or tweak them or whatever. And then the next step, and then it's the third step that really becomes magic, I think. You would start to put those words together into groupings of the words, because they would have words like flexibility or stability or security or something, or freedom. Well, take freedom for a second. Freedom is fascinating, because, and I learned this through this example, you start putting words together, helping them put words together. When you put words together, you find out that one person's freedom has to do with having options. Mm-hmm. Another person's freedom has to do more with like financial stability. Those are 2 totally different things.
They are 2 totally different things.
Totally different things. And another one is more like options, which is actually different than flexibility. Similar, kind of more similar than the financial stability, but those are 3, and I can name 10 other freedoms.
Oh, absolutely.
So you mix them together, and then the real magic comes in the finding a metaphor that captures what those particular words go together. And you were saying with the like leave no trace. Like if you just have a value that says like cleanliness and excellence, blah. Whereas if you have the value of the roofing company of leave no trace, that tells me what I'm doing when I'm working. That tells me how it tells me so many different things about how I go about doing that work beyond, and it kind of gets you out of the need to make this super specific list of all these like do's and don'ts. Like you would never have to say, don't flick a cigarette, or the other 10 things that you never even thought to tell them not to do.
No, and that's true. And credit where credit is due. I took that from Scouts. And so what happens when I was with my kids growing up in Scouts, and even Cub Scouts, so the younger kids, if you said, well, guys, we're leaving this campsite, we need to leave it clean. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's one thing, and what clean means to a 10-year-old boy is a really flexible subject. But if you say no, one of our values is leave no trace, then you form a line and you're looking for any clue that you've been there.
Absolutely, which comes
completely
to a whole
different
level. And so I had a client who had a very strong. We were working on their values, and they had on their values when I started working with them diversity, which I mean I don't have any. It's not like I'm anti-diversity. I just wasn't sure what does that mean?
That's an interesting one.
What does it mean? Yeah. And so we got to talking about it. And for them, when we started to pair the words together, for them, it's not just about, because for some people that's about providing opportunities. For some people that's about, I can list 10 different things. For them, they valued it so much, those things as well, but they really liked having, especially for the work that they did, having those other perspectives, like different life experiences, like vastly different life experiences and different life perspectives and whatnot. So for them, diversity was about this thing that as we played around with the words, and I just loved this so much. I can't remember what the other words that were together with diversity, but at the end of the day, the metaphor they came up with was there's always room at the table. And that starts to feel like something that you can use to make decisions by, because we want room at the table for other things. And so I love that practice because then the small things all get kind of, they get not sucked up into, but they get pulled along far more easily than if you try to focus on the small things and thinking what all the small things could be. It just feels like heavy clutter somehow.
Well, and the other part of it, as we wrap up, the other part of it is that a lot of times those one word value labels, whether it's diversity or whether it's freedom, they come attached with so much baggage. Because diversity, certainly in this country, you know, we think about racial diversity and we think about those issues, but that may be exactly what this company is driving for, but it may not be what this company is driving for. And so, I think the metaphor is important, but the first priority is choosing that filter through which you're going to examine the little things. So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories. You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.